Breaking news out of London, and it's absolute chaos. King Charles has just hit back, hard, and Keir Starmer's government is shaking from the blast. It all began on a tense Monday morning when the Prime Minister decided to do the unthinkable. In front of a crowd of journalists, Starmer accused the monarchy of meddling in modern governance. No jokes, no filters, no restraint. He said it plainly. The words hit like a thunderclap across Westminster. You could almost hear the air get sucked out of the room. Every political aide froze. Because in Britain, there's one unwritten rule: you never attack the crown. Starmer just did. Within hours, Buckingham Palace went silent. No statements, no briefings. Just a chilling pause that every insider recognized as the calm before something seismic. Reporters camped outside the gates for updates that never came. The palace's media line went dark. Behind those walls, something was moving. By nightfall, whispers started spreading. Charles had called his closest advisors to an emergency meeting. The meeting happened inside the king's private study. No press, no leaks, just heavy oak doors and the kind of silence that means business. Senior privy councillors were summoned, along with 2 constitutional lawyers who hadn't been inside the palace in years. According to insiders, the king's tone was icy. "This is no longer a disagreement," he said. "It's a threat to constitutional balance." That single sentence set the entire British establishment on edge. For decades, the monarchy stayed out of direct conflict with elected governments. Charles had always been careful, measured, diplomatic, cautious. But Starmer had crossed the line, and the king wasn't going to let the crown be dragged through the mud. By midnight, an operation was already forming, not political, not rhetorical, but legal. And that's when the palace decided to reach for something no one expected: the Supreme Court. Early Tuesday morning, before the sun even hit Whitehall, royal couriers were seen leaving the palace carrying sealed envelopes stamped "Confidential, Crown Authority." 3 destinations: the Speaker of the House, the opposition leader, and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Nobody knew what they contained, but one thing was clear: the Crown was activating something old, something serious. By mid-morning, leaks began hitting the press. The documents outlined a legal review codenamed Operation Sovereign Integrity. It wasn't a PR stunt. It was a direct constitutional measure to evaluate whether Starmer had breached his ministerial oath to respect the monarchy under the royal prerogative. The legal language was dense, but the intent was simple. The Crown was putting the Prime Minister under review. Within minutes, the story detonated. Every network in Britain dropped regular programming. Sky News ran a red banner reading, "The Crown Strikes Back." The BBC's political desk called it the most aggressive constitutional move by a monarch in nearly a century. Even foreign outlets couldn't believe what they were seeing. CNN described it as a live constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. At noon, the Supreme Court made it official. An extraordinary session would convene within 24 hours to review the Prime Minister's conduct toward the Crown. The announcement sent Westminster into meltdown. Ministers who had laughed off the King's silence the day before were suddenly locked in meetings. One Downing Street source described the mood as total disbelief. The monarchy hadn't just responded, it had escalated. Wednesday morning looked like a scene out of history. The Supreme Court chamber was packed. Journalists, diplomats, even former judges filled every seat. Outside, crowds gathered waving flags and chanting "Defend the Crown." The air felt electric, tense, unreal. The justices entered in silence, their expressions grim. This wasn't a typical case. It was a reckoning. The court began by reading through decades of precedent, from Edward VIII's abdication crisis to the 2019 prorogation ruling that redefined executive limits. The message was clear. The monarchy's constitutional respect is not ceremonial, it's foundational. Every word Starmer had said in that press conference was being dissected line by line. Legal analysts whispered that if the court ruled against him, it would destroy his political credibility. And then, after just 3 hours, the decision dropped. The verdict: the Prime Minister's remarks were inconsistent with the constitutional respect owed to the sovereign. 15 words that landed like a hammer. Not a criminal, not legislative, but politically devastating. It was the modern equivalent of a royal rebuke delivered through the judiciary. Perfectly legal, perfectly lethal. The moment the ruling was read, the chamber erupted. Reporters sprinted out to file breaking alerts. Protesters outside began cheering. Bells rang from nearby churches. On social media, Ush defend the crown and Starmer humiliated shot to the top of every trend list. Within 10 minutes, news anchors were already calling it the most extraordinary Supreme Court intervention in modern British history. Downing Street tried to contain it. Aides issued statements calling the verdict non-binding and symbolic. But no one cared about the legal fine print. The optics were everything. The Supreme Court had effectively declared that the Prime Minister disrespected the King and the country saw it live. By mid-afternoon, crowds had grown outside Parliament, waving Union Jacks and chanting for Starmer to resign. Police erected barriers as chants of "God Save the King" rolled through Westminster. The mood was electric, almost rebellious. For the first time in years, the monarchy wasn't a distant relic. It was power, live on air. Inside the palace, Charles stayed quiet. No interviews, no reaction. He didn't need one. The Supreme Court had just done what he couldn't say himself. It restored the authority of the crown without a single royal word. And across Britain, people finally realised the truth. The monarchy might be silent, but it's never powerless. Downing Street was in freefall. The Supreme Court ruling had detonated the government's image, and by dawn the next day, panic ruled every hallway. Advisors were on phones, spinning the same line. It was a misunderstanding. Nobody believed it. Even the networks that usually carried Labour's water dropped the script. Morning talk shows called it what it was: humiliation. The palace hadn't said a word, yet the government was collapsing under the weight of its own arrogance. By noon, Starmer tried damage control. A rushed press conference, stiff lighting, no audience reaction. He stood at the podium insisting his remarks about the monarchy were taken out of context. Every sentence sounded weaker than the last. Cameras captured the sweat, the stammering pauses, the hollow confidence. It was political death live on television. Reporters cut him off mid-answer to quote the Supreme Court judgment. Inconsistent with constitutional respect, the words echoed louder than anything he said. Cabinet loyalty cracked before the broadcast even ended. Senior ministers began distancing themselves on social media, careful but obvious. Angela Rayner walked out of an emergency meeting at number 10, visibly furious. Witnesses heard her shout, "You've made war with the monarchy, fix it or fall." No one argued. She left before the cameras arrived. That image, Britain's Deputy Prime Minister storming out, was replayed on every channel. By evening, the unravelling was total. One resignation, then another. A junior minister cited irreconcilable differences of constitutional principle. Translation: she refused to sync with him. The government that mocked the monarchy 2 days earlier was now disintegrating in real time. Civil servants whispered about contingency plans. Political aides looked for new jobs. Starmer's once tight command had turned into a televised implosion. Across the country, even lifelong Labour voters couldn't defend him anymore. The polls proved it. Trust in the Prime Minister plunged below 30%, the lowest in office. Newspapers that backed him months ago printed the same word across their front pages: unfit. Britain's most powerful man had become a liability overnight. By Thursday morning, Britain was no longer waiting for leadership. It was watching for fallout. Thousands flooded the streets outside Buckingham Palace, waving flags, holding placards that read, "Defend the Crown." Church bells rang in towns that hadn't seen protest in decades. Nobody organised it. It was pure, spontaneous loyalty, a nation rallying around the one institution that hadn't lied to them. Social media turned the chaos into spectacle. Crown wins and "Keir Starmer out" topped every trend list. Millions watched the same clips, crowds singing "God Save the King." commentators arguing about whether the monarchy had just redefined modern Britain. The country looked united for the first time in years, but not behind its government, behind the king. That evening, Nigel Farage went live on national television. Calm, confident, grinning like a man who'd waited his whole career for this moment. He called the Supreme Court's judgment a victory for national pride and praised King Charles for his measured strength. The studio audience erupted. Overnight, Reform UK's donations page crashed under traffic. Opposition parties could smell blood in the water. By the next morning, the BBC's lead headline called it the constitutional earthquake of the century. Anchor desks filled with stunned analysts. Nobody could remember a moment where a monarch, a court and public sentiment all aligned against a sitting prime minister. The country wasn't divided anymore. It was stunned into unity. And still, through it all, King Charles said nothing. No interviews, no statements, no royal appearances to gloat. That silence was his sharpest weapon. While the government scrambled, the king projected calm authority without a single word. On Friday, he attended a charity event in Scotland. He smiled, shook hands, and spoke warmly to children about education. No mention of the crisis. The images went viral in seconds. Side by side, clips of Charles smiling and Starmer sweating painted the entire story without narration. That same hour, Westminster was imploding. The Supreme Court's verdict triggered formal calls for a leadership review. The Speaker received letters from senior MPs demanding an internal vote. Starmer's authority was finished. Inside Labour headquarters, senior figures like Reeves and Rayner met privately, mapping succession scenarios. Staff described the atmosphere as pre-resignation mode. Behind the scenes, civil servants began drafting caretaker government procedures, contingency planning for a post-Starmer Britain. It hadn't happened in decades, but the words interim leadership started circulating again. The machinery of the state was preparing for transition. And in Windsor, the king waited. Advisors said he spent the morning in brief meetings with privy councillors, quiet, methodical, precise. There was no sign of triumph, just discipline. The Crown had already made its move. Now it was letting time finish the job. By sunset, Westminster looked hollow. The once busy steps of Number 10 were lined with reporters, waiting for the inevitable. Inside, the Prime Minister's team had split into factions, the loyalists who still believed in recovery and the realists already drafting farewell notes. Each hour that passed, another ally walked away. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. The king's silence stood for stability. Starmer's words stood for chaos. Public confidence followed the quiet. Every image, every headline, every broadcast repeated the same idea. The monarchy endures, politicians crumble. Britain just watched history fold in real time, and the question now is simple. Does this mark the return of royal power or the end of Starmer's rule? Subscribe, drop a like, and tell me, did King Charles just rewrite the future of British politics?